When I say mummies, which country comes to mind? Egypt, right? But guess what? The world's oldest mummies have been found in Southeast Asia from burial sites in China, Vietnam, and Indonesia.
Picture a bone-dry basin in the far west of China, ringed by mountains so tall they choke off every cloud before it arrives. No rivers worth the name. No rainfall to speak of. Just an ocean of dunes that the locals have called, for longer than anyone can trace, the place you go in and don't come out of. It's known today as the Taklamakan Desert, and it sits inside a larger depression called the Darim Basin. By every reasonable measure, it should be a graveyard of nothing, a place too hostile to leave a trace of anyone who ever passed through it. Instead, it turned out to be one of the best-kept secrets in the history of archaeology, and what it kept did not match anything anyone expected to find there. Start with the desert itself, because the mummies would not exist without it. Most of what we know about mummification comes from Egypt, where priests spent weeks packing bodies with natron salt and wrapping them in resin-soaked linen. What happened in the Darim Basin needed no priests and no plan. The air there is so relentlessly dry, and the ground so heavily salted, that a body buried in it is stripped of moisture before decay ever gets a foothold. It's not embalming, it's environment. An accident of chemistry repeated over and over for thousands of years. The result is preservation that in some respects beats the Egyptian tombs. Eyelashes still curled, skin creases still visible, the fine hairs on a forearm still standing where they dried in place millennia ago. The first sign that something extraordinary was buried out there came in 1980, when a team of archaeologists working near the ancient city of Lulan uncovered a woman wrapped in wool and felt, lying barely 3 feet under the sand. She would come to be called the Beauty of Lulan, and radiocarbon dating placed her at roughly 1800 BCE, nearly 4,000 years old. What stunned the researchers wasn't just her age. It was that her face was still a face. Not a skull picked clean by time, but recognizable features. A straight nose, a defined jaw, skin drawn tight but intact. She was remarkable, but she wasn't alone. And she wasn't even the strangest discovery to come out of that sand. Deeper in the desert lies a site now known as Shauha, the small river cemetery, sometimes called the Ordek Necropolis, after the local hunter who first guided outside researchers to it. When archaeologists finally opened it up properly in the early 2000s, they found something that looked less like a burial ground and more like a forest that had grown out of the dunes. Dozens of oversized wooden poles, some carved into shapes resembling oars or paddles, jutted out of the sand in tight clusters. Beneath them, bodies lay inside boat-shaped coffins carved from single logs, wrapped in hide, sealed against the elements. One woman from that site became known as the Beauty of Shauha. Like her counterpart from Lulan, she still had eyelashes. She still had hair. She was dressed in a felt hat with a wide, pointed brim, wrapped in a woolen cloak, her feet in boots lined with fur. Tucked against her body were small pouches packed with ephedra, a stimulant plant, placed there with obvious intention by hands that vanished from history 35 centuries ago. What made Shauha extraordinary wasn't a single spectacular burial. It was the sheer number of them. Hundreds of individuals, generation after generation, all preserved with the same uncanny clarity, all buried with the same care, in a landscape that by any measure should have been unlivable. And every single one of them raised the same uncomfortable question for the people who dug them up. They didn't look like they belonged there. Many of the bodies were tall, with deep-set eyes, high narrow noses, and hair ranging from pale blonde to a deep auburn red, features nobody expected to find in the heart of Central Asia, thousands of miles from Europe. Their clothing made the puzzle worse. These weren't people scraping together whatever hides they could find to survive the cold. They wore finely woven wool, some of it patterned with twill and check designs that echoed textile traditions from far to the west. Felt hats were shaped with real craftsmanship. One man was reportedly buried with several, as though hats were a small personal luxury, even out in that punishing sand. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. These people must have traveled from somewhere else. The only real disagreement was about the route. One influential theory pointed toward the Afanasevo culture, Bronze Age herders from the steppe near the Altai Mountains, who may have carried an early form of Tocharian. an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family, southward into the basin. Scholars including J.P. Mallory and Victor Mayer, the University of Pennsylvania professor who did more than almost anyone to bring these mummies to global attention, spent years developing this migration story. A second theory looked instead to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a network of irrigated oasis cities in what is now Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, proposing that farmers from that sophisticated culture had pushed east and settled the basin. A third theory pointed to the so-called Inner Asian Mountain Corridor, a chain of high valleys that could have funneled migrants down from the north. 3 theories, 3 different starting points on the map, but all of them agreed on one thing. They all assumed these people had arrived from somewhere outside the Dariem Basin. Nobody was debating whether there had been a migration. They were only debating which migration. Early genetic testing didn't settle anything either. Some samples reportedly analyzed in the early 1990s were said to hint at European ancestry, feeding the Western origin theories. Later in the 2000s, a team led by geneticist Hui Zhou at Fudan University reported a more complicated genetic picture, one that included East Asian and even South Asian markers among the remains. That result was disputed by other researchers, including Mayer, and the field was left with fragments of data pointing in different directions, none of it conclusive enough to close the case. Making matters more complicated, the mummies had become politically charged. To many in the Uyghur community of the region, the ancient remains were seen as ancestors, and their presence in the basin was taken by some as evidence of a deep historical claim to the land, a rootedness that predated later arrivals. Chinese authorities grew wary of that framing, and access to the remains for foreign researchers tightened considerably in the years that followed. The archaeology and the modern politics, 2 entirely separate questions, became difficult to pull apart. And this piece isn't the place to referee that dispute. What matters for the science is that the one tool capable of actually resolving the ancestry question, a full reading of the mummy's own DNA, had for the better part of 3 decades never been properly carried out. That changed in October 2021, when a paper appeared in the journal Nature titled, Genomic Insights into the Formation of Human Populations in the Dariem Basin. The research was led by geneticist Fan Zhang, working alongside an international team that included Harvard-affiliated anthropologist Christina Warner and evolutionary geneticist Chuanchao Wang, who had spent years pursuing exactly this question. For the first time, a team sequenced genome-wide data from the earliest known individuals buried in the region, 11 from the Xiaohe Cemetery itself, along with several more from the neighboring Dzungarian Basin to the north. These weren't people who arrived late in the region's history. They were among the oldest human remains the Dariem Basin has ever produced, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, the actual founding population that every migration theory had been trying to trace back to its source. The logic behind the study was straightforward. If these people had truly migrated from the west, from the steppe, from the oasis cities of Central Asia, from anywhere at all, their DNA would carry a signature of that homeland. Migration always leaves genetic fingerprints. Find the fingerprint, and you find the route. That was the entire premise going in. What the genomes actually revealed overturned nearly a century of assumptions in one stroke. There was no trace of Western steppe ancestry, none of the genetic markers that an Afanasevo migration would have left behind. None of the signals a Bactria Margiana origin would predict either. The founding population of the Dariem Basin had not arrived from anywhere. They were a genetically isolated local group, descended from people who had already been living in that region since the early Holocene, thousands of years before the first grave at Xiaohe was ever dug. Their genetic makeup turned out to be remarkably simple, considering the mystery surrounding it. Roughly 72% of their ancestry traced back to a population known as the ancient North Eurasians, with the remaining share coming from an ancient Northeast Asian source. Every competing theory had proposed a different distant homeland. The DNA answered that none of them applied. And there was something even stranger in the data. While every neighboring Bronze Age population across the region was busy mixing and intermarrying, spreading genes outward in every direction, the Dariem founders were doing the opposite. They stayed almost entirely to themselves, generation after generation, a closed genetic pocket sitting right in the middle of a region otherwise defined by constant contact and exchange. This reframes the entire mystery. The original question was, where did these outsiders come from, and by what route did they travel to end up buried in the sand? The genome data erased that question outright, because there was no arrival to explain. These were not newcomers who looked out of place. They were descendants of a people who had simply always been there, holding their ground while the world around them changed completely. If they weren't migrants, then who exactly were their ancestors? Because the Western-looking faces still needed an explanation. That trail leads back to the ancient North Eurasians, a population of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who once ranged across the frozen interior of Siberia and then largely disappeared from the archaeological record as the glaciers retreated. For a long time, geneticists suspected this population existed only because other groups' DNA seemed to require it, a kind of statistical ghost, visible only in its effects, never in a body. Then, in 2013, a team led by Esk Willerslev in Copenhagen sequenced the genome of a child buried near Lake Baikal roughly 24,000 years ago, at a site called Malta. That individual, now known to science as MA1, gave the ghost population its first confirmed face. The ancient North Eurasians left almost no unbroken line of direct descendants, yet fragments of their DNA are scattered across an enormous swath of the modern world. A substantial share of Native American ancestry, by some estimates between 14 and 38%, traces back to this same source, and so does a meaningful portion of the ancestry carried by many modern Europeans. A population that vanished from the archaeological record still managed to leave its genetic fingerprints on opposite sides of the planet, in groups that never cross paths. That is exactly the lineage the sand of the Taklamakan had been protecting all along. The Dari mummies weren't distant relatives of the ancient North Eurasians. They were some of the best preserved direct representatives of that population found anywhere on Earth, held intact by salt and dry air long after the wider lineage had faded into fragments everywhere else. Their features were never out of place. They were simply far older than any of the migration theories had reached back to consider. And there's a second layer to the story, one that has nothing to do with bloodlines. Chemical analysis of residue on the mummy's teeth showed traces of milk proteins, confirming that this isolated population were dairy herders almost from the start. Yet their broader diet tells a very different story from their genetics. Researchers found evidence of wheat and dairy practices that trace back to West Asia, millet farming that came from the East, and ephedra sourced from Central Asian trade networks. In other words, this closed-off, genetically isolated population was absorbing agricultural knowledge, herding practices, and medicinal plants from every direction the compass offered, while apparently marrying almost none of the people who brought those innovations to them. That's a genuinely strange contradiction to hold in your head. A community open enough to adopt farming and herding techniques from across the continent, yet closed enough that virtually none of the people who carried in that knowledge ever became part of their bloodline. Trade and ideas moved freely across their world. Genes did not move with them. Zoom out, and the significance of that 2021 study is bigger than 13 bodies in one cemetery. It rewrote a basic assumption about how the interior of Asia was settled in the first place. The assumption that new technology arriving in a region always means new people arriving alongside it. The Darien founders proved that assumption wrong. A community can absorb farming from one direction, herding from another, and medicine from a third, weaving the influence of an entire continent into their daily lives, without a single outsider ever entering their gene pool. Of course, the DNA didn't answer every question. Whether these people actually spoke an early form of Tocharian, the extinct Indo-European language later documented in the region, can't be determined from genetics alone. Linguist Elizabeth Whelan-Barber has cautioned against assuming a direct link, pointing out that roughly 1,000 years separate the mummies from the earliest written Tocharian texts. Plenty of time for a language to spread into a region without any accompanying migration. Other scholars, including linguist Ronald Kim, argue the chronology could still support a connection. That debate remains open, and the evidence available doesn't force a resolution either way. There's also the matter of scope. The 2021 study, groundbreaking as it was, sampled a single cemetery at a single point in time. Geneticist Vagheesh Narasimhan has noted that broader sampling across more sites in the basin could complicate or refine the picture considerably. And access itself remains limited. Ongoing political sensitivities around the region mean that much of what these remains could still reveal stays out of reach for now. So here's where things actually stand, no further than the evidence allows. A century of assumptions about a mysterious Western migration into the heart of Asia was overturned by a single, careful reading of ancient DNA, and what it revealed was stranger than any of the migration stories that came before it. These were never travelers who wandered into the wrong desert. They were survivors, the last visible trace of an Ice Age population that had otherwise all but disappeared from the earth, holding their ground in one of the most hostile landscapes on the planet for thousands of years while absorbing the world's ideas and refusing its people. The beauty of Lulan and the beauty of Xiaohe still lie where the desert preserved them, faces intact after 4,000 years, still wrapped in the felt and wool they were buried in, still carrying hair the color of straw and rust. For 100 years, they were treated as outsiders, evidence of some ancient journey waiting to be mapped. Their own genetic code told us something far stranger. They were never outsiders at all. They were what remained of a people who were already ancient before their story in that desert had even begun, a ghost lineage from the Ice Age, alive now only as scattered fragments of code carried, unknowingly, inside a large share of the modern world. And the Taklamakan, true to its name, is almost certainly still holding onto more than it has given up. Why?